The 10th unit is going to focus on labor. Now, labor, in its very barest essence, and when we were talking about that, we were talking about human labor. It's a factor in the production and distribution of goods and services. But one thing we're going to be talking about in terms of labor is that we should never ever forget that there is a human element to labor. It's not a number. It's not a statistic, even though it can be applied numerically and statistically. It is a human issue. And if we are going to be good Christians when it comes to our study of the economy, we do have to consider the human element. And we'll be popping that up all throughout this because, again, there is a very, very real human element that is sometimes missing when people talk about the prospect of labor as it pertains to the study of economics. We know the relationship very well. Employers in general pay workers to produce goods and services that the employers can sell to make a profit and stay in business. And of course, by staying in business, that means they're able to feed their families as well. The purpose of starting a business is not to provide jobs. Not with most of them. Now, there are some very philanthropic guys and girls who start businesses for the just for the sole purpose of employment. That's great. But for the most part, businesses are not created with the idea of producing jobs in mind. They are produced with the idea of making money, making a product. And the jobs are simply a happy byproduct of that quest. But again, as we'll keep going back to this, behind all these economic principles and whatnot, and the raw, cutthroat business world, when we talk about labor, we are talking about real people who are trying to pay the bills, trying to put shoes on their babies' feet, trying to put food in their wives' or husbands' bellies. The idea that Karl Marx pushed upon us, that workers create wealth while owners simply take advantage of the workers and skim off the profits, is so simplistic as to be laughable. And when you really, really think about it, you have to wonder how in the world did Karl Marx ever become considered a serious economic theorist. But as we well know, particularly in small businesses, many times the owner works harder than anybody. This is their livelihood on the line here. Workers can get another job potentially. The owner, the ship goes down, the captain of the Titanic stays on after the iceberg damage is done. That's another bad metaphor, but you get the idea. The workers provide a service that the owner needs in order to keep the business open. It is a symbiotic relationship. They each rely on the other. There are extremes of thought that see ownership as Scrooge McDuck swimming in a pile of gold coins in his home, that they are just hoarding this wealth and they are very penurious about paying their workers. And there have been times in history where that was a very, very accurate depiction of the moneyed class. Thanks to the democratization of economics and a whole lot of other factors, that is very, very rarely the case. That's almost a comic book portrayal of the rich, the business owner. The average business owner is middle class, upper middle class, usually putting in as many hours as their employees, if not more, and who takes the proceeds, the profits of their business, and quite often reinvest them, either in the business or in another venture. And again, each relies on the other. If the owners did not provide places of work and work to do, laborers could not earn money. If there were no workers, the owner could not produce their products. So again, business and labor depend upon each other. But our history, particularly economic history here in the U.S., shows that it quite often has been and still is a very acrimonious relationship. Anytime money's involved, anytime stuff is involved between two people, there is going to be some acrimony. That's human nature. That's unfortunate. But there's going to be, at the very least, if not acrimony, friction, potentially, most of the time. And what we have to do in a study of economics that takes into account our Christian beliefs, what we are going to have to do to reconcile that is to realize that there are very real human beings on both sides of this equation. Sometimes people only want to consider the humanity from the worker standpoint. There is something to be said for the humanity of the employers, because again, the vast majority of time, they are not Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos or someone who is swimming in a vault of money, laughing all the time. That's a caricature. That's not the case most of the time. Think about the interaction of work like a recorded song. Your book has a good example. Someone writes the song. The singer and musicians perform the song. Others produce the recording. They take it onto formats that customers can use. Put it on a CD or an MP3 or whatever. Other people are in charge of promoting the music to customers and performing all of the other 10,000 tasks that are needed. The recording company provides the studio, the equipment, the means of production, distribution. There are a whole lot of people involved in the production of that thing, in this case a recorded song, that consumers will purchase. There's more than just one person involved, and each of them, if any of them do not perform well, it's going to impact everyone. The idea of supply and demand, which drives so much of basic economic theory, is very much applicable when it comes to talking about labor. There is a supply of available labor, and there is a demand for particular labor. As with any commodity, labor does have a price. Supply and demand determine that price. One example that I like to use, and I've used this in economic lessons for years, is your job, what you are compensated for in your job is usually going to be in direct proportion to the quality of services that you provide and the demand for that level of quality. Clayton Kershaw is probably still the best pitcher in baseball. If not him, I mean, you could say Corey Kluber or, I don't know, Trevor Bauer is a good candidate, Garrett Cole perhaps. But let's just say right now, Clayton Kershaw, the best pitcher in baseball. He has elite talent. He can deliver services that only a handful of people in the entire planet can deliver. And he delivers it in a field where there is high demand. But he delivers it also in a field that is very large, very popular, very rich. If Clayton Kershaw was the #1 lacrosse player in the world, he still has elite level services to offer. He still has services to offer that only a few other people on the planet can. But there's not much of a market for it. There's not much of a, what's that word, demand for it. I think there's a professional lacrosse league, but they're not going to get paid $22 million like Clayton Kershaw does. So again, the demand for your labor at the skill level you provide is going to have a lot to do with your compensation. I hate to say that again because we're talking human elements. And I hate it. And boy, how much of a jerk do you have to be to point out to somebody that, well, anybody could do your job, that's why you're paid so little. You know, it may be true in some respects, not to 100% respect, but it's just mean to dwell upon that. What I prefer to do is to flip it around and focus on not why the menial worker is paid so little. I focus on that demand structure, which tells us why the elite level person in a high demand field is making so much money. Now, let's say 10 years from now, Major League Baseball is, for whatever reason, not nearly as popular as it is right now. Whoever that providing that level of service will no longer be able to command $22 million a year because baseball, the business, is not generating that much money. The demand is down. That level of service is the same, but the demand is down. Now he's closer to the guy who's the world-class lacrosse player who does not have a lucrative, multi-billion-dollar industry in which to display their talent. But that's kind of an extreme example. In industries, demand differs. the demand for horse and buggy whip operators is not what it was 145 years ago. There is zero demand really for that today, outside of a couple of niche businesses. In the late 1800s, a teamster in that respect, they were very much in demand, and they, as a result, could command a pretty high salary. If you were the best teamster in the world right now, there's not much you can demand. You're in a position to demand nothing because there is not a demand for those services. So in that case, labor is a commodity just like any other that depends heavily upon the idea, the theory of supply and demand. Changes in the labor supply, that is, the available amount of labor out there, can come through any number of reasons. Population growth or drop, the ages of workers of the labor force, changes in training opportunities and whatnot. So there's a whole lot of things that can impact the availability of labor. And that availability is a very, very, very important thing. One of the things that has held Danville back in some recent years is the lack of availability of a highly trained workforce in certain areas. Now, we've gone a long ways towards fixing that, but 20 years ago, if a high-tech machinist wanted to open a factory in Danville, he was going to have to go somewhere else to get their jobs because there were very few people in Danville that were being trained for that. We fixed that. Now we have actually a surplus of laborers. Again, supply and demand, we got more machinists and high-tech business machine operators than what we have opportunities for. Again, that ebb and flow, it always changes. It's never going to stay the same, always, never. There are so many other factors that play into this constantly shifting supply and demand of labor. Ideally, best case scenario, the work that people do gives them a sense of purpose. Ideally, it blesses others, provides the worker, the employer, and the consumer with what they want and need. That's the best case scenario. That's what we're going to strive for. We usually fall short, but sometimes we get it right. The idea is to get as close to that as possible. Now again, as we well know, not all work is the same. For years, work was divided up into the white-collar category and the blue-collar category. White-collar because the guys, mostly guys who did it, usually wore white shirts, was office, managerial type things. You didn't get your hands dirty very much. Bankers selling insurance, high-level manager or whatever. The blue-collar work was the hands-on. Quite often the factory workers' uniforms that they wore every day were blue or bluish. So we started to get around that line of thinking. About the middle of the 20th century, 1950, about 20% of the workers were white-collar and the rest were blue-collar. Today, it's mostly 60% white-collar. Now, the thing is, today, we have created so many jobs that do not require high degrees of manual labor that we have lots of white-collar workers, but they are not getting that elite-level pay that white-collar workers in the 50s and 60s say we're getting. So that's not really an accurate way to divide people anymore, white-collar versus blue-collar. As a matter of fact, I mean, just the tendency towards more casual business attire has kind of thrown those old terms out the window. One of the things that we are seeing in the modern U.S. economy is that more workers are self-employed. About 11% of the population is considered self-employed, and in many cases that's someone who owns or operates the business. Even though they have 40, 30, 100 employees, they're self-employed. A lot of what we have today are people like me who are employed by themselves. They are part of the gig economy where you earn money, compensation for certain tasks that you do. And as the internet has made delivery of so many other services possible, the gig economy is what they're calling that now, is growing. The image of someone going to work for a company in their 20s and retiring 40 years later with a gold watch and a nice fat pension, that used to be the rule. It is now very, very, very much the exception. The average U.S. worker changes jobs 7 times. That's just the average. And I think that average is actually going up as we speak in terms of the modern economy. And of course, as we've discussed before, here in the Danville area, that old model was the model for some time, with Dan River Incorporated dominating employment. The idea was, and for a lot of people, this was it. They got a job at the mill in their 20s. They worked there 40 years and retired. That was their economic life. That model doesn't happen anymore. Very, very few people start in a business and stay there for 40 years and retire. You bounce around from job to job now. Or if you're like me, you bounce around from gig to gig while working for yourself. And that model just simply doesn't work anymore. Again, because a lot of that tied itself to manufacturing. Again, for years, textiles were in high demand. And we discussed the economic changes, trade changes that the U.S. made, which made it much more lucrative for Dan River, Pluma, Fieldcrest Cannon, and others to ship the lion's share of their production overseas. So it was just simply the jobs were no longer available. That was obviously a big issue for Danville, and still is. We're still recovering from that. The entry of more women into the workplace has changed the supply of labor. We add 1 million new immigrants each year. That adds to the labor supply. And you can there are many questions that we have around immigration. Indeed, in the news this week, the latest surge, illegal immigration in this case, is the hot story. And it causes us to ask all the familiar questions when it comes to the impact that immigration, and in this case illegal immigration, has on the economy. What does it do to that labor supply? If you have 1 million primarily non-skilled workers coming in, that has one impact. But we all know that there are a lot of people from foreign countries who, say, come here for college, particularly from Southern Asia, India, and whatnot, who get their degrees here, from Africa even, and decide to stay here with their professional services. Again, if you get a lot of those, your available labor supply is changing, and the economy has to adjust to take that into account. Next thing we'll talk about is unions and the idea of labor unions and the impact it's had on the U.S. economy and the impact it even has today. Since the beginning of time, people have worked for other people to some degree. And for most of history, those who were the business owners, the property owners, the owners of stuff, who employed other people, who used the services of other people, they had significant power over those people, the owners, that is. They had a lot of control over the working conditions that were present. From centuries ago even, workers began organizing themselves into unions. That is to say, they decided, okay, all 15 of us here that are digging this ditch or whatever, let's say we all get together and go to the boss and say, hey, we demand 10% increase or whatever, or we're not going to work. Then all of a sudden the boss has to decide, wow, can I replace all these people, or is it just cheaper just to go ahead and give them what they want? So that's the idea behind a labor union, is that you and the other workers are a collective. You are a group. And when you go to negotiate with you are one person. All 100 of you, 1,000 of you, 10,000 of you are one entity to be considered. You can see in the U.S. economic situation and in the way society was, how labor unions could have flourished, and they did. Again, the owners held all the cards, and because there were very, very few legal protections for workers, workplace deaths were frequent, injuries were almost a daily occurrence in some industries. There were some, great tragedies at the workplace. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, where, 100 women died in a fire at their place of work. Labor unions had a lot of fuel to form because workers felt like they had nobody protecting them. If your boss told you to do a dangerous task and you didn't do it, you're out of work. You would see where a labor union would be very, very appealing to somebody like that. You would like to be able to say, no, I'm not going to do that, and because I'm in this union that's forced this contract, you can't tell me to do that. So you can see where a labor union would be very, very appealing to somebody like that. And quite frankly, you can see where a labor union would be necessary under those circumstances when there are no laws on the books to prevent your boss from telling you to do a dangerous task and firing you if you don't do it. The thing is, what labor unions did in the first half of the 20th century is that not only did they organize workers, they lobbied Congress to pass these fair workers laws, these workplace safety laws. And now it's part of the books. Even if you're not in a union, you cannot be fired legally for refusing to perform a dangerous task for your employer. That now no longer requires a labor union. That's part of American law. And the labor union movement in that respect, a lot of what they push for, fair pay, workplace safety standards, workplace safety measures, that's in law now. When they formed, many of them, that law did not exist. Now that that's in law, what's a union to do? Unfortunately, in some cases, quite frankly, in many cases, the pendulum has moved over here. And now the unions, in many cases, exist sometimes just to maintain their relevance. We'll be talking about that just a little bit more in a second. Really was part of a societal change in the 20th century. The society at large recognized the right of labor unions, first of all, to exist. And unions, again, of course, gained the ability to shut down a factory with a strike. That was a tool that was used many times and still quite frankly is. Around the middle of the 20th century, again, 1950, about a third of all American workers were members of unions of some sort. One of the ways that the unions leverage this power into, again, swinging that pendulum a little too far the other way is creating so-called closed shop laws, where if you're going to work at this factory, you have to be a member of the union, whether you want to or not. Okay. Virginia does not allow that. Virginia is called a right-to-work state. You have the right to work in a company and not join a union. Now, what the unions have done in many cases since then, again, those that are deeply entrenched in certain industries, a task called feather bedding. Basically, they will, part of their collective bargaining agreement, their CBA, they will say, okay, you have to employ 150 workers in this part of the production. Even if the owner only really needs 100 people to make that, now the union says you got to employ 150. So there's going to be 50 people, at least, with not a lot to do. But the union is going to protect those jobs because that's 50 people paying dues to them and making them more money and making them more substantial, making them a bigger lobbying arm. You know, numbers of power where unions are involved. The more workers they have, the more authority they have, the more power they have. The power of labor unions grew significantly in the middle part of the 20th century. Congress did get involved, like we said. They passed the National Labor Relations Act, and which basically gave a framework of governance, legal parameters between management and employees. If you're going, these are the rules you operate under when there's a union around, when there's not a union around. Business owners began using new strategies. A lot of the auto plants stopped building cars in Michigan and moved to South Carolina, Alabama, where they were right-to-work states, where they could make cars and trucks without paying the artificially inflated prices that come from unions. And that's, yeah, if you can bargain collectively and threaten a strike every time someone blows their nose, you're going to end up with a higher wage than you would otherwise. That's just the natural consequence. But something else started happening too. As society changed, workers in other industries found out that very soon they were making more or less the same money as the union workers were, because it became advantageous to large employers to not have to worry about a union forming. How do you do that? You treat your workers right. You give them good wages, good benefits. You treat them like a human being. And you'll be amazed at what happens. I'm of the opinion that today, if a unionization drive at a factory is successful, it's the factory's fault. It's management's fault. You brought these conditions on yourself. The biggest example, and again, this is one of the advantages of having done local news for a while, the IKEA plant here in Danville opened in like 03, 04, and it was ironic because IKEA in Sweden still has a legendary reputation for treating workers great. I mean, their workers' compensation packages and days off in Sweden are just legendary in the industry. Well, they opened a plant in the U.S. and somebody thought they were still Dan River Mill, the only employer in town. They treated their workers like crud. I had several of the workers talking to me during their unionization drive about how the immediate management was treating them, like this was the only job you're ever going to have, and if you don't do exactly what I say, then I'm going to make life difficult for you. That's the good thing about this economy we have. You don't have to take that from anybody. Not unless you're in a monopolistic type situation. And that still exists sometimes, and that breaks your heart. But most of the time, you don't have to you don't have to put up with being treated like dirt like that. Anyway, they unionized successfully, and there is now even though there's a new owner, there's a union at that site. So there's still union activity, but it's not nearly what it used to be. Again, we talked earlier about the economic conditions, which meant a large number of manufacturing jobs going overseas. The manufacturing jobs were the easiest to unionize because basically you could do more damage with a strike at a factory than you could, say, at a national insurance chain or something like that. The manufacturing used to supply most of the union workers. Now it's usually white-collar workers. The SEIU, the Service Employees International Union, are, clerks and stockers in grocery stores and, other blue-collar workers without the blue collar, I guess you could say. There's also the specter of government unions, which I won't cover here except to say that government unions are an inherent conflict of interest. We'll talk about that some other time. If you want to ask me about that, let me know. But government unions should be illegal. But we'll talk about that later. Are labor unions helpful or harmful? Yes. They've been both. You cannot deny unions' positive impact on U.S. workforce safety laws. No denying. They may eventually get passed
because, again, of societal changes, but they were passed much earlier because of labor unions.
Labor unions did help foster a change in the way the American society at large views the differences between labor and management. Can you imagine this? Ty Cobb was the best player in baseball in this year we talk about, 1913. He hit a game-winning base hit one time, and fans stormed the field after it, and one of them took his hat from him, and he never got it back. The owner of the Detroit Tigers told Ty he had to pay him $2 to replace his hat, his uniform. This is the most popular, or not the most popular, but the best player in the game, a very popular game, but he had no union. And he had basically nothing more than, his celebrity, such as it was. He ended up shelling out the $2 to get the new hat. They had to pay for the uniforms. Today, baseball players are, very tight union, and it is, in a century, the power has completely shifted. So in that respect, labor unions have done a lot of good. They've done a lot of bad too. Again, there is a reason for the stereotype that exists at some factories of the guy sitting there reading the newspaper all day who is at an airplane, works at the airport, let's say. He's a union worker at the airport. Somebody said, what's his job? Oh, he turns the propellers on the planes. I said, we haven't had planes with propellers in 20 years. Try telling that to the union. That kind of thing. That's an exaggeration, but not really. Not in some cases, it's not. The power of unions, like the power of most anything, has at times gone too far. And we see it in other aspects of society where an entity forms because of an injustice, because of a lack of equity. They work hard. They get most of what they wanted initially. What do you do then? After you've achieved your goals as a labor union, you've got workplace safety laws. You've got legal guarantees of equal pay or adequate pay. You have government agencies to enforce the things you've been fighting for years. Now what do? You still have all these members here. You're going to find something to keep yourself relevant. If there's not a problem, you will invent a problem because you have to remain relevant. That is the price of success. Union leaders in the past have used their power to restrict access to jobs that they only wanted their friends to have. African Americans have been particularly struck by this. So the specter of a union and their history and impact on the U.S. economy is an example of trade-offs. Certain unions have enabled their worker to earn a higher income, in some cases a fair income, but at the price of fewer people working in those industries. The higher pay has led for higher prices for consumers, as businesses have to jack up the prices of individual items in order to pay the increased costs that have come from union activity. Is it good or bad? Yes. We'll talk more about that on Monday. It is a tricky history. My personal opinion, I think I've kind of made it clear here, there was a time when unions were very, very necessary, absolutely essential. They grew out of a yawning, gaping, obvious need, not just in the economy, but in our collective American souls. But once they got most of what they originally formed for, they started inventing problems in many cases. Just a word about income. Again, basically, your gross income is what you earn before taxes, net income after taxes. Again, your pay, as we mentioned earlier, I'm not going to go back to this, your pay is subject to the laws of supply and demand. If you are providing, number one, a high-level service, number two, in a high-demand area, you're going to be compensated handsomely. If you are providing a high-level service where there is very little demand, you're not going to be compensated handsomely. If you offer a poor service in an area of high demand, you're not going to be compensated handsomely. Very simple. Some things are very simple. Another debate we will have is the idea of the minimum wage. Again, that's a very contemporary issue. Currently it's $7.25 per hour. People do the math, 40 hours a week, and add it to that, and they say you can't live on that. And in many cases, they're right. If you lived in the middle of San Francisco, you can't afford a house with that. You can't afford anything with that. But if you live in Two Dot, Montana, you can probably get by on that. Again, one of the problems with the minimum wage is that it treats something as essential as income as a one-size-fits-all solution. That's not the case. We'll talk about this on Monday. The real minimum wage is zero. That's the real minimum wage. Now, what a business is required to provide to their worker, I think should best be left between that worker and the business owner. Because in the way we have things codified here, the American worker has more authority and more choice than they've ever had before. You no longer have to go begging for a job in this economy because there are none other available. You may beg for a job because it pays well or whatever, but in terms of just having any job, it's not like that anymore. I don't like the minimum wage insofar as it treats every sector of the United States exactly the same. Also, it hits the small business the worst. If you have a small widget making business and you employ 10 people, and let's say you are paying them $7.25 an hour, let's say Joe Biden and them get their wish and the minimum wage is $15 an hour. Let's say it's very unskilled work. All you got to do is push a button and here and your widgets are made. The price that you can charge for the widgets stays the same, right? Maybe not. All of a sudden, if it cost you $1,000 a week to make widgets and then it costs you $2,000 a week to make widgets, you're going to do something. You're going to increase the price of widgets or you're going to make less of them. Remember that marginal analysis we looked at with the car repair shop last week? You're going to do the same marginal analysis and find the point at which you can produce widgets and make a decent profit with fewer workers. And who loses in that? The workers who get laid off. Now all of a sudden, the minimum wage that we spent so much money on trying to implement, all of a sudden they're not working anymore and they need help. And that's another stress on government resources. Again, that's a very simplified solution, but again, that is something we have to consider at all times. I'm going to go ahead and close it out with that, and when we talk Monday, we'll talk a little bit also about the idea of production, that side effect of labor, what you produce, and how that adds to an overall economy. My hair looks like it's about to fly off. I need a haircut. I'll probably have the same crappy hair when you see me on Monday, but that's when we'll see each other. Take care.